The classical music world has become so competitive that most of these young talents don't have the time that it takes to blossom. And if the teacher holds back, they would feel not supported or not believed in. And the multiplication of the music schools in the world has multiplied in such numbers the well-skilled performers that the main ingredient, which is what they bring through their trade to the repertoire which they serve, and which inevitably needs to be revisited several times after their initial discovery of it, until they manage to introduce their own meaning on the meaning of the piece itself. You could say that this is anyway the result of life's experience, therefore they cannot be students till death. But in a way, I feel that that's what music, reflective, expressive, researched, needing to be extracted from a niche to be brought to a popular stage and enrich the repertoire by the belief in it of a given artist who might have discovered it as a student, but besides the expected core repertoire, there is the necessity to become able to not recompose but to retell the narration of the piece and captivate an audience that assumingly doesn't know about it, or perhaps vaguely, and then contributes to the musical world by bringing it to light. Of course, not everybody is Mendelssohn for Bach, and even then it must have been quite a challenge. But today the numbers and the available opportunities for the future artists, students now, to have venues where to express themselves in terms of connection with the audience, the old-fashioned way almost, so to say today, the concert hall. So either they self-program, either they have to be chosen, either they have to go through the filter of the competitions, which deadline is age 32, which means that in a way it holds them hostage of their hope that through the lottery they can start a career before 32, or that they can take the time to develop a repertoire, which doesn't mean that I, for instance, wouldn't believe in a student's quality if I suggest to study Lieder Cycle by Strauss, Wolf, and then in parallel to the Waldstein, the Appassionata, of course you would think they want to measure themselves with the established repertoire, widely available in recordings from almost everybody who has played it, of course, until at least from the beginning of the 20th century. But beyond that, I find that having been exposed, very privileged I was to develop my thirst for musicianship, which I had no clue how to or if I had to when I was 7. And then when my parents brought me to Mademoiselle Boulanger in Paris, this initiation was a long path. We wouldn't go to the next step of a given exercise until it's understood and fully discovered by oneself in terms of the purpose of the rules that bring you to shape better your musicianship through voice leading in contrapoint and fugue, and especially harmony, overall as a knowledge but also as a usage, as well as the performing skills of the works that we all have at some point to fill in some of the untold. Either the composers choose to put some grace notes and not more define the rhythmic length of these grace notes. And besides few masterful and respected authorities, musicologists, who define where you place it in the style of this or style of that, you have to still, when you play it, it has to become your statement, not just because you obey the rules. You want to understand the purpose of the rules. And this kind of development, which I was given to because of my thirst for composing and playing, through nuclear amounts of solfege, which today is mostly considered, in fact, ear training, but beyond, also theory of music, grammar, before harmony, and then later contrapoint, and at some point fugue. Contrapoint being the most liberating because you think in terms of intervals beyond in terms of stylistic tainting of the choices. For instance, in harmonization, you date it very easily because of the stylistic rapport to the usage of given chords, predominantly in given composers' works. So, if I was not thirsty to compose, would have I also been brought to learn so much about the music theory? Or was my perfect pitch necessarily a shortcut that could have not necessitate the learning of the seven clefs reading and and all these things? Sometimes I wonder. I think potentially creativity is not something that you command. It's something that, as a teacher, you shape. So that when the student is searching for the boundaries outside of the notations, details which leave room for interpretation by essence, then they can not recompose, as I said, but probably rethink. And an articulation, a phrasing, a tempo, a pedal, there's so many variables subtly that customize an interpretation which is not set in stone. Or perhaps it is during the time you meet it for the first time, the piece, as a student, and you find that you admire such performer of it, and with time you might change your opinion about the aesthetics of what means to you. Also, because of the famous competitivity for which I spoke earlier, most of the students are not given the choice to think about it. They chase one degree after the next in order to complete studies that will allow them to become credible teachers on the market, which is shrinking, alas. And in a way, it's like rushed fed. And what could take 10 minutes for one and might take a year for another shouldn't be the comparison. But they must be rules in obviously mass organized teaching institutions where every degree has a certain time limit to be completed. One size fits all talents, or one size fits all hearing, perfect pitch or relative pitch or no. And the connection, the desire, the drive, the inspiration, the appetite the students have to reach, and therefore, while trying to reach, defeat their shortcomings with the help of the wisdom of the teachers, who tells them to take it with this fingering, to organize that way the thought of the stage fright, and hear it for the piece itself more than only for the way they heard it by others, and organize their own choices from an analytical point of view of a flow of a line, of how many bars constitute a bar groupment that leads to an arrival point, which would be the aim, beyond climax or not. The syntax of the speech, the eloquence of the delivery, the breathing for the statement, different sentences. All that is shaped by the experience of a given style, or in comparison and contrasting to another style. That's why I think that this complete cultivated musician, who through a pianism in this case would in fact express all through their spontaneous and learned, or not, well, it should be and rather than or, learned knowledge about it. Copied, perhaps. At some point, it's perhaps the way they like to be motivated when they hear somebody's recording and say, "I like to play like this person, this piece." But it takes a little longer sometimes to develop in a student their own sense of rethinking the piece. It's not about right or wrong, opposite or in unison with the teacher. As a matter of fact, as always, the student brings this fresh eye, fresh ear, fresh soul at the piece, regardless how often played before, or recorded, published, printed, written about, and all, or how less or little known. There's nothing more meaningful than to see a conviction driven pianist applying the right tools of technique to reach this artistic goal. Without the technique, independence of fingers, balance of the hand, stiffness, the arm, of course, the tendons, the body extraction of the sound that is different for each morphology, since the keys are the same size. And most pianists start very early. Perhaps some didn't, but most do. And so by growing up, the keys become, in a way, narrower. And in order to play clean, as they say, it's more tricky than when you're a child, but for different reasons. You couldn't spread enough the hand, and now you have to be more precise exactly where you place your finger on a key. If it's a low key that is heavier in the action of the pianos, but written pianissimo or piano, like the beginning of the Liszt sonata, for instance, then you have to know exactly to play it on the edge because of the leverage and the capacity of having its peak as soon as you touch it from the edge with a straight finger. Since the expectation is to translate what is meaningful to you from the text, which you put again one more time back alive. You resuscitate the piece from the written text. And I find that no matter how much it's defined by reasonably researched authenticity-wise publications, regardless if one agrees or not on how they interpret the different notations, as I often find as a teacher that the writing of a composer, which is left for us to discover and put it alive ourselves, bring it to a new life, aware of traditions, but also intuitively driven to perhaps play what you think is right, even if it's not in the canons of the beauty that are presently or in the past have been established. And then the notation itself, like the distribution of the patterns of the texture in the two hands, and that I think is the place for the teacher. How to enhance either inner voicings, either outer voicings, either balance between ranges, how to imagine that on the fortepiano, on which it might have been written 2 centuries ago or so, the straight strings bring to have different, almost timbres, like orchestral woodwinds, let's say brass and strings components between the low, middle, and top register, for which, in order to balance on their piano, they octave the basses, but then single note the top notes of the high register. And on the modern pianos that are cross-strung and more powerful because of the 3 steel strings and the whole action that is brilliant and also rounded and perhaps even longer than the decay they had, depending on the tempo you take. Again, all these ratios have to be taken into account. But at some point, you have to play it for what you believe, or you're told, or you came up to even perhaps believe against the way you were taught, by saying, after all, that might be wise and well established, but I like it this way. And I think that in an interpretation, that is important. In a course that you teach, less, because you have to explain the reasons of the choices, the difference between still galant and baroque and classical and then early romantic and then impressionism, expressionism and post-tonality, etc. So these are the reasonable arguments. But inside each piece, you find things that trigger your imagination or your reminiscence of another piece that is unrelated even chronologically. But because of the modern piano, then you have to re-establish the balance that, in fact, the octaves in the left hand were there to balance because the basses were weak on the straight string compared to the top, and on the cross string, it's quite the contrary. The bass is overwhelmed by their richness of tone and harmonics and projection, the high notes. And of course, you cannot change the octaves from one hand to the other because that's not allowed. But you can shape by voicing in the octaves, perhaps the third more than the fifth, and obtain a depth of left hand rather than projection of left hand. Well, you project, but you don't project all at the same level, but with some difference of voicing, which gives, in fact, a sculpted depth. It's like a 3D shaped bass. If you would, as an orchestra, cello and then double basses playing the same an octave lower, it gives that sense of depth more than power. But it does, on the piano, being percussive instrument, compete a little bit more with the power than the depth, if not voiced. But those are choices that come after analytical understanding of the texture and its translation on the modern piano for the intention that we detect in the composer through the notation, which in fact could bring us to play for what it is, regardless on what we do. Pedaling and balances between ranges. The homogeneous cross-strung piano advantage is that most of the ranges have the same roundness of sound. So what you gain is homogeneity, and what you lose is individuality of each range. So it's almost like playing a symphony on the piano where you imagine, oh, this is the woodwinds and this is the strings. And this imagination brings your playing to translate it. But when it's a solo piano piece, you can do that too, according to the type of texture, and then try to think if that pedaling would work, if that voicing would work, or is it not necessary? And of course, you can have two ways of thinking. I play what was written regardless on what, or I try to implement what I think was the reason for these octaves in the bass. That becomes a lot of second guessing, even in creative voice leadings that are not indicated by up or down stems in some section, because in a way, when you love a piece, you start thinking, hearing even more into it than was indicated by the score, which doesn't mean that the composer refused it. Perhaps the composer chose not to. And that's what we have to respect, at least as a teacher, to give them this rule. But rules are there too to be understood for not only their meaning and their obedience that has to be presented with, but also to understand or try to understand or hint the meaning of it and the reasons for it. Not that everybody agrees. It's a matter of fact, it is true that most pieces are understood differently by most people who play these pieces. Not drastically. Okay, you have tempo fluctuations between one and another. You have quality of legato or quality of non-legato, quality of staccato, according to the choices or the capacities of the performer. And so when you put together the variables between the grace notes and their different rhythmization, because it's not indicated by choice, left to the performer outside of the context of when it was played. And so musicologically, you can accept to equalize grace notes or to read articles that prove you one and then read an article that proves you the other. And ultimately, when you play it, you have not only to make a choice, you have to construct it in the preparation, but in the delivery, sometimes you have to keep a sense, especially in chamber music, of flexibility in the way that you complement each other. Not all accelerandi have the same drive, and not all ritenuti are the same amount. And it depends if it's a comma, a semi-comma, a colon, semicolon. All these things are what makes the culture of the playing. And of course, when they're very young, most of the very gifted, as we call them, of course, lack of better knowledgeable, perhaps talented, or perhaps more strongly intuitive or more sensitive to this art form by serendipitous genetics. Because then you feel like I don't have to tell them, they already feel it. And that is part of the advantage that some people take when the competition being as it is, they bypass a lot of the stages of developing their musicianship, their culture, their capacity of self-teaching themselves by analyzing the texture as taught, which takes longer than just say, play this way. And if obedient, then they do. And if successful, then they don't need to question it. Of course, if they're not successful, then they ask, why didn't I pass this round? And some jury member will tell them something like faster, slower, more legato, more musical. Generally, this kind of generalities. And then they go back to the canvas, so to say, and they say, how can I play it more convincingly for the next competition? Audition. After classes, job auditions. After job auditions, eternally putting your trade to the vulnerable questioning of it all, as if for a painter the painting evaporates and painter has to repaint it every day. And that's why replaying it, it's not the same every time. And by the time you organize these variables in some things that allow you not to be vulnerable on stage to the unknown, unexpected, or uncontrolled, which with age you learn to control, then you're ready earlier and you compete. And while it's very rewarding to have a goal in time towards which to wake up every morning to practice, or every night to stay longer to practice, because you know that you have to accomplish yourself, which is the self-esteem essential thing. But the deadlines are the trouble. There are always deadlines for exams, for auditions, for competitions, for everything. And how to arrive always ready for the expected level of each stage on this long artistic path ahead. Repertoire and culture and curiosity and capacity of learning faster and developing deeper the knowledge of the piece when revisiting it, in order to create a sense of your own statement, not just a recitation of the score, which is difficult as it is already to do, to play clean or pass the obstacles, as most have to do in their first meetings with a piece that gives them, if not trouble, it gives them a challenge, which is healthy, and the competition for that is healthy. The results are not healthy because sometimes the demoralization is to be transformed into enthused new repertoires or new approaches, ways, so that the students can rebounds from a given setback and not lose hope or trust or self-esteem, which is so important and so fragile and so vulnerable when the competition is so fierce that all ages, there is no hierarchy. Everybody is on the highway of the hope for the career in music. And of course, in order to develop an artistry, you have to be able to, the length of your life as an artist, you have to be able to renew yourself. And these are the tools that help you to renew yourself. They appear to be taking longer than just going through the performance, but it shouldn't be separate. You shouldn't separate technique from musicianship. That shouldn't be, because the one nourishes the other. Without the technique, you cannot express an artistry, and without knowledgeable understanding combined to your intuitive drive, you cannot renew the repertoire's approach. Not that you have to renew it, but one way or the other, you have to go through, how will I handle this section? Which fingering will fit me best? That's where I think the teacher is helpful. But beyond the student becoming artist teachers in their turn, they have to be able to have enough of this musicianship luggage that allows them to travel through the trip of an artistic life. That is one more of my spontaneous metaphors.